The wedding invitation lay in the trash, its ivory edges curling from a splash of tea I'd spilled earlier. My name was never meant to be on the guest list. The envelope had come by mistake, left in my mailbox by a careless hand. I stared at the gold letters, the promise of joy I was not meant to witness. The paper was still soft beneath my fingers, but the truth was hard as stone. Even my own child wanted my absence wrapped in silence. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. My apartment is small, but it is enough for me. A single bedroom, a kitchen just big enough for one chair to fit comfortably at the table, and a living room lined with photographs. Each one a frame holding the story of years that moved faster than I could hold them. In the corner sits my sewing machine, the same one I used when my boy was little, when I'd patch the knees of his jeans or hem the sleeves of his Sunday shirt so they wouldn't fall past his hands. Outside my window, the street is quiet most days. It is a modest neighborhood in a small Midwestern town where people still wave to each other out of habit. My rent is subsidized, my income comes from Social Security, and the small survivors benefit from my husband's years of factory work. I keep a tidy home not because I expect company, but because it's the only way I know to live. I turned 72 this past January. My knees complain when I take the stairs too quickly, and my hands ache a little more in the mornings. Still, I keep myself moving. I walk to the grocery store for the few things I need. I tend to the potted violets on my windowsill, and I write letters I never send. Little notes to the people I miss, written just to keep my heart in practice. I raised my son here in this town, though the house we lived in back then was bigger. He was my only child. His father and I married young, and we didn't have much, but we built a life that was steady. My husband worked nights at the factory, I worked days at the diner, and between us we kept the lights on in the pantry full. When my boy was in high school, his father's health began to falter. Factory work will do that to a man. There were hospital visits, medical bills, and more than one winter where I worried we'd lose the house. But we managed. I took in extra shifts, sewed clothes for neighbors, even cleaned offices on Saturdays. It was exhausting, but I never wanted my son to feel the weight of our struggles. I remember sewing his prom suit on that old machine in the corner. We couldn't afford to buy one, so I worked through the night until my eyes blurred, making sure it fit him just right. He never knew I stayed up until sunrise, stitching the lining by hand. When he came down the stairs that evening smiling, he looked so proud, and that was worth every ache in my back. College was another hurdle. We didn't have the money for tuition, but I scraped together what I could and he got a scholarship for part of it. The rest came from the life insurance policy his father left when he passed. I didn't touch that money for years after my husband's death, but when it came time for our boy to start his life, it felt like the right thing to do. He graduated with honors, found a job in the city, and for a while he called often. I'd hear his voice every Sunday afternoon, telling me about his work, his new apartment, the places he'd visited. I'd hang up feeling proud, imagining that somewhere deep down, he still carried pieces of home with him. The change came quietly. First, the calls came less often. He'd say work kept him busy. Then it was that he was seeing someone, a young woman named Claire. The first time I met her, it was Thanksgiving. She was polite, beautiful, well-dressed, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. She asked me small questions, the kind people ask out of obligation, not interest. I tried to make her feel welcome, even sending her home with the pie I'd baked that morning. Over time, I noticed her influence in small ways. He started visiting less, and when he did, the visits felt shorter. My phone calls went to voicemail more often than not. If I asked about wedding plans because I knew it was coming, his answers were vague, like the topic wasn't meant for me. I didn't let myself think too much of it. I told myself that young people have their own lives, that love changes the way time is shared. Still, there were moments that stung. One Christmas, I learned through a neighbor that my son and Claire had hosted a holiday dinner in their home. A dinner I hadn't been told about. I imagined their table, full of laughter and warmth, and felt the quiet of my apartment press in a little heavier that night. Life went on. I filled my days with small routines, the kind that keep the loneliness from settling too deep. Morning tea, a book by the window, a walk to the park if the weather allowed. I reminded myself of the years I had given, the nights spent working, the sacrifices that no one ever asked me to make but that I made anyway. I thought those things would mean something forever. Then came the wedding. Or rather, the absence of it. The first I heard of an actual date was through a mutual acquaintance, a woman from church who'd seen the announcement on social media. She assumed I already knew. I smiled and told her I did. But when I got home that afternoon, I sat down in the quiet and realized no one had told me directly. I tried to believe that an invitation would come in the mail. Days passed. Weeks. Then one afternoon I found it, the envelope, creamy white with gold lettering tucked in my mailbox. My name wasn't on the front. It was addressed to the neighbor in the apartment next to mine, who shares a last name with me but no blood. I held it in my hands longer than I should have, as if it might change. I thought maybe, just maybe, there had been a mistake and inside I would see my own name. But when I slid my finger under the flap and peeked at the first line, I saw it clearly, her name, his name, the place, the date, and nothing that belonged to me. That's when the truth sank in. It had been delivered to me by accident. My own child's wedding invitation, meant for someone else, sitting in my hands like a mirror I didn't want to look into. I put it in the trash. I told myself it didn't matter. But as I sat there, the edges curling from the tea I'd spilled, I felt the ache in my chest spread wider than I'd ever known. And deep down, in a place I hadn't touched in years, something in me began to shift. The days after finding that invitation were heavy, like moving through air that had turned to water. I tried to go about my usual routines, folding the laundry while the kettle hummed, walking to the market for bread, but everything seemed quieter, emptier. Even the sound of my own footsteps felt distant, as though I'd begun drifting away from the world without anyone noticing. The small humiliations had been happening for months, but now I began to see them with sharper edges. There were the phone calls that went unanswered for days, sometimes weeks. When he did pick up, his voice was hurried, as though speaking to me was an interruption in his day. There was the time I learned from a neighbor's passing remark that my son had bought a new house, a detail I hadn't been told, even though I had been the one to lend him part of the down payment years ago when his credit was tight. Holidays became the hardest. One Thanksgiving he told me they'd already made plans, and that it would be too hectic to add another place at the table. I spent that holiday alone, the smell of a half-roasted chicken filling my apartment as I set one plate at the table and pretended it didn't matter. I told myself I preferred the quiet, but every time I lifted my fork, I saw his face as a boy, cheeks flushed from the cold, running into the kitchen to tell me the turkey smelled perfect. Even when I was included in something, there was a distance, as though I was being allowed, not welcomed. On his birthday the year before, I brought him a gift, an old watch that had belonged to his father. I had it cleaned and polished, the leather strap replaced. He thanked me politely, but I could tell he didn't understand what it meant. A week later, I saw it in a photograph on Claire's brother's wrist. When I asked about it, he said he'd given it away because it wasn't really his style. I began noticing how my presence seemed to make Claire uneasy. If I asked about the wedding, she'd smile politely and change the subject. When I offered to help with preparations, she'd say everything was already handled. There was always an invisible wall, and I could never tell if she had built it, or if my son had. The last time I saw them before the wedding news broke, it was at a small family gathering for my cousin's birthday. My son and Claire arrived late, greeted everyone but me first, and sat at the opposite end of the table. I tried to catch his eye, to share a smile the way we used to, but he was too busy leaning in to hear Claire's whispers. I don't know if I imagined it, but I could have sworn I saw her glance my way and then look quickly back down at her plate. It was in those moments that I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel toward my own child, the quiet suspicion that he was embarrassed by me. I am not ashamed of the life I've lived, but I know it is plain compared to theirs. My furniture is secondhand, my clothes are mended and remended, and the car I drive rattles like an old tin can. Perhaps in their world where everything gleams and costs more than I make in a month, my presence feels like a reminder of beginnings they would rather forget. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before I found that misplaced invitation, I left a message on his phone. I had baked his favorite apple bread and thought I might drop it off. He didn't call back. A few days later, I saw on social media, through a photo someone else had posted, that they'd hosted a Sunday brunch at their house. The picture showed the table covered in food, the two of them smiling together in their kitchen. My bread had gone stale on my counter. I threw it away without tasting it. It wasn't just being left out, it was being left out quietly. No fights, no sharp words, just the slow erasing of my place in their lives. And perhaps that's what made it so painful. If there had been anger, I could have defended myself. But how do you argue with absence? I began to feel the weight of it everywhere. At the grocery store, I'd see a mother and son shopping together and wonder when we'd stopped having days like that. In the park, I'd watch couples my age holding hands and think of my husband, and how we'd always imagine growing old surrounded by family. Even in my apartment, the photographs on the walls seemed to look back at me differently, as if the people in them belonged to another woman entirely. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen. I felt it settling into my bones, heavy and cold. And yet, under all of it, a small voice had begun to stir. A voice that reminded me of the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, the love that had shaped my every choice. It didn't speak loudly, not yet, but it was there waiting. For now I stayed silent. I carried the small humiliations quietly, tucking them away where no one could see. I didn't know then that soon one moment would bring them all into sharp, undeniable light. That moment was coming faster than I realized. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone rang. The sun had just begun to slide behind the buildings across the street, casting long shadows across my kitchen table. I was folding a dish towel, my hands moving slowly, when I saw his name on the screen. My heart did what it always did, leapt first, bracing for joy, before settling into a slower beat, wary of what might follow. I answered quickly, hoping to sound warm, as if the ache from weeks of silence hadn't settled in my voice. His tone was clipped. He asked if I had a minute to talk. I told him I did. He didn't waste time. He said the wedding was going to be small, just close friends and a few family, and that they'd decided it would be best if I didn't come. He used phrases like less stress and keeping it simple, but every word was a careful step around the truth. The truth was that my presence was unwanted. I listened without interrupting. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as though he'd gone over the words in his mind before dialing. My own voice felt far away when I finally said, "I understand." And I did understand, not the decision itself but the reality beneath it. There was no place for me in the life he was building. When the call ended, the quiet in the apartment deepened. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, the towel half folded on the table. The light in the room had shifted to that soft, dim glow just before night takes hold. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the ticking of the wall clock, and beneath it all, the slow crack in something I thought could never break. I had always believed that no matter how much time passed, no matter the distance between us, the bond between mother and child was unshakable. I had believed that the years of sacrifice, the long nights, the skipped meals, the endless working, had carved a place for me in his life that no one could erase. But bonds can be loosened quietly over time, until one day you realize they've slipped free without you noticing. I thought of the day he was born. How small he'd been, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, his eyes blinking open for the first time. I remembered the weight of him in my arms, how I had whispered promises he couldn't yet understand. Promises to keep him safe, to give him every chance at life, to be there for every important moment. I thought of all the birthdays, the scraped knees, the nights I'd waited in the car outside his part-time job just to drive him home. It was a strange thing, realizing that you've kept every promise you ever made to someone, and they've quietly decided you no longer belong. I sat there for a long time, the room growing darker around me. My hand stayed still in my lap, and I felt the warmth of the phone slowly fading against my skin. The tears didn't come right away. When they did, they were slow, not the kind that come from sudden grief, but the kind that seep up from somewhere deep, where they've been waiting. They slid down my cheeks and fell onto my hands, leaving tiny dark spots on the fabric of the towel still resting there. I wasn't crying for the wedding. Not really. I was crying for the years I had poured into building a life for him, for the moments I had missed for myself so he could have more. I cried for the gap between the boy I'd raised and the man who had just told me there was no place for me at his table. Outside, the sky turned a dusky blue, and the first streetlights flickered on. My apartment felt smaller than it had in years, the walls pressing in. I stood up, moving slowly, and walked to the window. Across the street, a young couple was carrying grocery bags inside, their laughter rising faintly through the air. I wondered if his laugh still sounded the same, or if it had changed into something I wouldn't recognize. That night I didn't cook. I made tea though I barely tasted it. I sat in my armchair with the cup in my hands, staring at the steam curling upward until it disappeared. My mind kept returning to one thought. If love has conditions, is it love at all? I had spent my whole life believing that love between family was unconditional, that even when it was strained, it was still there. But sitting in that chair, I began to see love differently. Love, when it turns into something that asks you to shrink, to stay silent, to disappear, that isn't love. That's something else entirely. It was a sharp realization, but it didn't come with anger. Just a deep, tired ache. I didn't want to fight him. I didn't want to beg. I didn't even want to ask for an explanation. I wanted only to understand where my own worth began and ended, and to see clearly that it did not live in his approval. By the time I set the empty cup down, the night was quiet and the air in the apartment had cooled. I got ready for bed without turning on the television, without checking the phone again. But before I turned off the light, I found myself looking at the old envelope in my desk drawer. The one with my late husband's life insurance paperwork inside. It had been years since I'd opened it, but I knew exactly what it contained. The records of the money I had used to send our son to college, to help him get his first apartment, and most recently to cover the deposit for the wedding venue. I had offered it freely, never thinking I'd have to hold proof of my own generosity. I closed the drawer gently, the thought lingering like the low hum of a distant engine. I had given him everything I could, and he had shut the door in my face. It would take a few days for the ache to quiet enough for me to hear it clearly, but something had shifted inside me that night. I didn't know it yet, but the first threads of resolve were beginning to weave themselves together. The morning after that phone call, the air felt different. Not lighter, no, the heaviness was still there, but it had settled into something quieter, less frantic. The sharp sting of the night before had dulled into a low, steady ache. I moved through my morning routine as though I were watching myself from a distance. Kettle on, bread toasted, curtains open to let in the pale winter light. On the kitchen table, the towel from yesterday was still folded halfway, exactly as I'd left it. My hands lingered over it for a moment before I smoothed it out and set it in its place. Small acts of order, they were the only things I could control. But in the quiet, my mind kept returning to that drawer. The one that held the thick, aging envelope. Its flap soft from years of being opened and closed. I had kept it tucked away not because I had forgotten about it, but because I didn't need to see it. Every page inside was a reminder of the times I had stepped in, without hesitation, to help my son when life asked more of him than he had. I pulled the drawer open and took it out, holding the weight of it in my hands. The paper inside was crisp in some places, worn in others. There were photocopies of checks, bank statements, and a letter from the insurance company all those years ago, the last tangible tie to the life my husband and I had built together. I spread the documents across the table, the morning light falling in stripes over the numbers and signatures. I traced my finger along the one that showed the transfer I'd made to cover the deposit for the wedding venue. I remembered the phone call when my son had asked, his voice almost shy, as if it was hard to request such a sum. I told him without thinking that of course I would help. It wasn't even a question. I had told myself it was for love. That's what parents do, they give. They don't keep score. But looking at those papers now, I realized something I had never dared admit. Keeping no record of your worth makes it easy for others to pretend it never existed. I wasn't angry. Anger is loud, and what I felt was quiet. It was a deep settling into myself. A recognition that if I didn't stand somewhere firm, I would be erased completely. I had already been written out of the wedding. I would not let myself be written out of my own story. I sat there for a long time, my fingers resting on the paper. The idea came slowly, like the first shift of wind before a storm. Not a plan for revenge, not a demand to be included, but a choice to reclaim what had been mine all along, my dignity. I thought about calling him, about asking if he remembered where that money had come from. But then I pictured his voice, calm and polite, as though my question were just a matter of paperwork, not heartache. And I knew, this wasn't a conversation to have with him. This was something I needed to handle differently. In the top drawer of my small desk, I keep a worn address book. Most of the names in it belong to people who have either moved away or passed on, but one name still mattered, Daniel Harper. I had known Daniel since we were both in our 20s. His mother and I had worked together at the diner, And when she fell ill, I used to bring her meals and sit with her in the afternoon so she wouldn't be alone. Years later, Daniel became a lawyer, and once in passing he told me, "If you ever need help, no matter what, call me." I had never taken him up on that offer. Until now. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I dialed his number from memory. When he answered, his voice was warm, surprised but familiar. I told him I needed to meet, that it wasn't urgent but it was important. He didn't ask many questions, just gave me a time to come by his office the next afternoon. After hanging up, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks: steadiness. Not happiness, not even relief, just the sense that I was finally taking a step instead of standing still. The rest of the day passed in small, deliberate motions. I made a pot of soup, watered the violets, and sat with my husband's journal in my lap. I ran my fingers over the cover, thinking about all the years he had been my anchor. I imagined what he might say if he knew what had happened. I think he would tell me not to shrink, not to let the love we'd built be treated as invisible. By evening, the envelope was back in the drawer, but the decision had taken root. I wasn't going to knock on their door or send an angry letter. I wasn't going to demand a seat at the wedding. But I was going to make sure that what I had given, not just in money but in years, in love, in presence, would not be erased. As the sun set, I found myself standing by the window, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. I thought about how easy it is for people to overlook what's quiet, to mistake silence for absence. But silence can also be a choice. And mine from this moment forward would not be the silence of being dismissed. It would be the silence of someone who knows exactly who she is, and no longer needs to beg others to see it. That night I slept without dreams. When I woke the next morning, the air felt the same, but I was not the same. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. The next afternoon, I dressed with more care than usual. Not for beauty, those days are long behind me, but for respect. A clean blouse, a pressed skirt, the soft cardigan my husband once said brought out the color in my eyes. I packed the envelope into my old leather handbag, its edges worn and softened from years of use, and slipped on my shoes. The walk to Daniel's office took 20 minutes. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you fully, and the wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke from chimneys nearby. I passed the bakery on the corner, the one where I used to buy cinnamon rolls for my boy when he was little. I didn't let myself linger on that memory. Not today. Daniel's office was on the second floor of a brick building above the hardware store. When I stepped inside, the space felt warm, lined with books and framed certificates. He rose from his desk when I entered, his face breaking into a smile that reached his eyes. He asked how I'd been but didn't press when I simply said, "I've been managing." We sat across from each other at a wide oak desk. I placed the envelope between us, smoothing the flap before sliding it toward him. "These," I said softly, "are records of the money I've given my son over the years. Most recently, for his wedding." He leafed through the papers slowly, taking in each line. His expression didn't change much, but there was a shift in his eyes, the way someone looks when they begin fitting puzzle pieces together. When he'd finished, he leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests. "Do you want the money back?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "No. That's not what this is about." He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. I told him as simply as I could about the phone call, about being told not to come, about the invitation I wasn't meant to see. I spoke without tears this time. The story had moved from raw to solid, from wound to fact. When I finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady. Then he said, "You want to make sure they can't pretend you weren't part of this." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. He reached for a pad of paper and began jotting notes. "There are ways to do this quietly," he said. "Without a fight, without a scene. We can send a letter, factual, clear, documented. That states your contribution and interest. No demands, just the truth. Once it's on record, it can't be ignored or erased." The words settled over me like a blanket. Not warm exactly, but grounding. This wasn't about forcing my way in. It was about standing where I belonged, even if only on paper. We spent the next hour going over details. He asked for dates, amounts, and any written exchanges that confirmed my role. I had more than I realized. Emails from my son thanking me for the transfer. Notes about how this will make the day possible. I hadn't thought much of them at the time, but now they were proof. When we were done, Daniel promised to draft the letter by the end of the week. "You don't have to do anything else," he said. "I'll handle it." As I left his office, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in months. Not joy, not yet, but a quiet form of relief. For so long I'd been holding the hurt in my chest like a secret, unsure if anyone else could see it. Now someone did. And more than that, someone was willing to help me carry it. The days that followed moved slowly. I kept to my routines: morning tea, the short walk to the park, tending the violets. But underneath, there was a steady hum of anticipation. I knew the letter was coming. I didn't know how it would be received, and I didn't much care. Its purpose wasn't to change their minds. It was to place a marker in the ground that said, I was here. I mattered in this story. On the third day, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "It's done," he said. "Sent this morning." I thanked him, my voice calm. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded, letting the words settle. I pictured the letter arriving, the careful envelope, the crisp paper inside, the weight of truth in black and white. No emotion, no plea. Just the facts, like stones laid in a path no one could sweep away. That evening, I took out my husband's journal again. I wrote about the meeting, about the letter, about the strange peace that comes when you stop asking for acceptance and simply claim your place. I ended with a single line. "This is not a fight. This is a remembering." The letter was only the first step. I didn't know what would follow, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had stopped standing in the shadows of my own life. I had stepped forward, even if only a little, and that was enough to start. The days after the letter was sent moved with the slow weight of winter. I didn't hear anything from my son, not right away, and that was fine. The silence gave me space. Space to think, to remember, to understand why this wound felt so familiar in my bones. It wasn't the first time I had been shut out by my own family. I had seen this kind of erasure before, long before my son was born. I was 23 the first time it happened. My own mother had been the one standing outside, looking in. It was after my grandfather died. He had owned a small farm just outside town. Nothing grand, but enough to keep the family fed. In his will, he left the land to be divided evenly between his children, my mother and her 2 brothers. My mother thought that was how it would be. She believed in the fairness of paper, the way signatures and stamps made promises strong. But my uncles had other plans. They were older, louder, and knew how to turn people's ears their way. At the meeting with the lawyer, they told her it was too complicated to divide the land 3 ways, that she didn't really need it since she had married and moved into town. They suggested she sign her share over, for the good of the family. My mother hesitated, just long enough for me to see the hurt in her face, and then she agreed. I didn't understand at the time why she didn't fight. Later, she told me she was tired, that she had spent her whole life being told she took up too much space, and in that moment she didn't have the strength to push back. We were not invited to the first family gathering on the farm after that. I remember standing with her on our front porch that Sunday, hearing the faint sound of music carry on the wind from down the road. She stood there for a long time, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I wanted to ask her why we weren't there, but I already knew the answer. She never spoke badly about her brothers. She never confronted them. She simply carried on, keeping her pain folded neatly inside, like the good linen she only brought out for company. But from that day forward, I saw the way her shoulders curved inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller, easier to ignore. I told myself I would never let anyone do that to me. And yet, years later, here I was, standing in her same shadow, holding my own version of that exclusion. Different details, same hollow space. I think of her often these days, especially in the quiet moments. I think about how her life would have been different if she'd had someone to stand beside her, to say, "No, you belong here." She didn't have that. But I do. That thought became clearer after the letter was sent. I realized that my choice to act, to place my truth into words and send it into their hands, was not just for me. It was for her too. For the part of her that had been told to stay home, to keep quiet, to disappear from her own family's story. I remember one afternoon, years after the farm had been taken from her, when she came into the kitchen while I was sewing. She leaned against the counter watching me work and said quietly, Sometimes the only thing you can do is make sure they can't forget you. I hadn't understood then. I do now. It's strange the way old wounds never truly close. They just hide beneath the skin until something new brushes against them. And then they ache like they were made yesterday. The ache I feel now is the same one I saw in her eyes that day on the porch. But unlike her, I won't let it settle into my shoulders. I won't carry it quietly for the rest of my life. The flashbacks come in fragments, the smell of the farm kitchen, the sound of my mother's voice when she called me in from the yard, the way her hands would still when she heard her brothers' names. They remind me that history repeats itself when we let it. And I've decided I won't. I may not be able to change my son's choices, but I can choose mine. And mine is this: to stand where I am, uninvited if need be, but present. To leave a record, even if it's only in the form of a letter, that says I was here, I mattered, I gave. It is not about making noise. My mother never made noise, and still her absence was felt. It's about making sure the truth exists somewhere outside of me, so it can't be buried when I'm gone. The letter was my way of saying to the world, and maybe to her memory, that I would not be quietly folded away. In the evenings now, I find myself looking at the small photograph of her I keep on the shelf. She's younger in it than I am now, standing in front of the farmhouse before it was taken from her. There's sunlight in her hair, but her eyes are squinting against it, as though she already knows it won't last. I wish she could see me now. I wish she could know that her daughter learned from her, both the quiet endurance and the cost of it, and chose differently. The hurt I feel is deep, but it's not empty. It's layered with her story, my story, and the quiet decision that this will be where it ends. It was a week after Daniel sent the letter that the next piece of the truth arrived. I wasn't expecting it. I had gone about my morning as usual, a short walk, a stop at the post office, when my phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen. His voice was calm, but I could tell from the way he began with, "I think you should know," that something had shifted. He'd received a reply from the wedding coordinator. A polite, formal letter confirming the financial arrangements for the event. Only, according to their records, the deposit for the venue had been paid by the family of the bride. No mention of me. No trace of my contribution. The document even included an amended payment log, dated months after my transfer, showing the deposit being fulfilled by a wire from Claire's parents' account. It was a clean swap, as though my role had never existed at all. Daniel said he'd seen things like this before, how money can be quietly replaced in the books, how names can be omitted, and how, without proper proof, the truth can be erased in a single updated file. He told me my original receipt still stood as evidence. He said this didn't change the fact that I had paid it first. But it did mean one thing. Someone had gone out of their way to write me out of the story. When I hung up the phone, I just sat there at the table, my tea cooling in front of me. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about the way they'd taken my gift, turned it into something else, and then erased the giver. I remembered the day I'd sent that transfer. I'd walked to the bank with my scarf pulled tight against the wind, the envelope of paperwork tucked under my arm. I'd smiled at the teller as I signed the forms, feeling quietly proud that I could still help him in this way. I had thought about my husband the whole time, how he would have done the same without question. And now, months later, that kindness had been scrubbed away like it was never there. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the sharp sting I might have expected. Instead, I felt something colder, steadier, the kind of clarity that comes when you see a thing for exactly what it is, without any softness left around the edges. I thought of my mother again, of how her name had been taken off the deed to her father's farm, replaced neatly with her brother's. Different story, same tactic. It wasn't enough for them to have what she'd given up. They had to erase her from the record so no one could say she'd been part of it at all. I stood and went to the drawer, pulling out my copy of the bank transfer receipt. I held it in my hands, the paper firm beneath my fingers, the numbers printed in ink that could not be unwritten. I thought of how they might be sitting somewhere right now, planning their wedding, telling themselves that I hadn't been involved, that they'd done it all without me. Perhaps it was easier for them to believe that. Perhaps they needed the story to be cleaner. No reminder of the mother they'd chosen not to invite. But the truth was here in my hands and it would stay here. That night I called Daniel again. We agreed that the reply from the coordinator would be kept alongside my own records, not as a challenge but as part of the file. Sometimes, he said, It's enough to hold the truth and know you can prove it if you need to. I told him I understood. And I did. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, the lamplight spilling over the wood. I didn't feel like cooking. I made a slice of toast, poured a small glass of milk, and ate slowly, my thoughts steady and quiet. This was the lowest point, not because of the exclusion itself, but because of the confirmation that it was deliberate. They hadn't simply forgotten me. They had made sure to remove me. It's strange how, when you reach the bottom of something, the world doesn't stop. The street outside still hummed with traffic. The clock still ticked on the wall. My violets still leaned toward the last of the evening light. Life didn't care that I'd just seen the full shape of the betrayal. And in a way that was a comfort. Because if life didn't stop here, then neither would I. I washed my plate, dried it, and set it back in the cupboard. Then I picked up my husband's journal and wrote down everything Daniel had told me. Word for word, date and all. Not because I planned to use it, but because I wanted the truth to live somewhere beyond my own memory. When I closed the journal, I felt a small shift inside me. It was as if I had reached the farthest edge of hurt and found there was nowhere left to go but forward. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would decide what forward looked like. The morning after Daniel's call, I woke before the sun. The room was still, the air cool, and for the first time in weeks I didn't reach for the phone. There was nothing left to check. I knew where I stood. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, watching the pale light spread across the floor. My mind felt clearer than it had in a long time. Not because the hurt was gone, but because it had settled into a place where I could look at it without flinching. I realized something important in that quiet. I didn't need to keep proving myself. I had spent months, maybe years, trying to stay in their circle, answering questions they didn't ask, offering help they didn't take, making myself smaller so I could fit into a space that kept shrinking. But the truth was, no matter how small I made myself, the space was never meant for me anymore. So I stopped. I stopped calling. Not in anger, but in understanding. I didn't send small updates about my day. I didn't ask about theirs. I let the silence sit where it belonged. I imagined they might notice or they might not, but either way, I would no longer be the one to keep the rope taut between us. The first few days felt strange. My phone stayed quiet, the apartment quieter still. In the evenings, I would sit with a book and feel the familiar urge to reach for the phone, to send a quick message. But I reminded myself, this was not punishment, this was preservation. Every time I resisted, it got easier. I began filling my days differently. I walked to the library more often, losing myself in the smell of old paper and the comfort of shelves lined in neat rows. I signed up for the Tuesday knitting circle, even though I hadn't picked up needles in years. I stopped hurrying through my grocery trips, taking the time to chat with the cashier about the weather or the fresh bread delivery. My world became smaller, yes, but it also became mine. There was a freedom in no longer bracing for the next small humiliation. I didn't have to wait for a call that might never come, or hear about family events after they'd passed. My days were no longer shaped by the absence of their attention. I even began to notice small things again. The way the morning light hit the violets on the windowsill, the rhythm of my own footsteps on the sidewalk, the sound of the wind curling around the corners of the building. These were things I'd overlooked when my thoughts were crowded with them. One afternoon, as I was walking home from the library, I passed a cafe I'd never been in. The air smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, so I stepped inside. The young woman behind the counter smiled in a way that reached her eyes, an honest smile, and asked how my day was going. I told her it was peaceful, and I realized I meant it. That night, I sat in my armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It occurred to me that the peace I felt wasn't because I had won anything, but because I had stopped playing a game that was never mine to begin with. The records, the letter, they existed now as proof, but I didn't need them for my own heart. I had them in case the truth was ever questioned, but the act of keeping them was enough. I didn't have to stand on anyone else's stage to be seen. Sometimes in the early mornings I would imagine what my life might look like a year from now if I kept living this way, quietly, intentionally, without the weight of trying to fit into places I didn't belong. I pictured my apartment just as it was, the violets blooming, the table neat, my days steady. There was nothing grand in that vision, but it was solid. And solid felt better than chasing something that would always slip through my fingers. I knew there would still be moments when the ache would rise again. That's the thing about loss. It doesn't leave entirely. It just changes its shape. But I also knew I could carry it now without bending under it. On the third week of my quiet shift, I received a postcard in the mail from the library. A reminder about the community book sale coming up. I smiled when I saw it, not because of the event, but because it felt like an invitation to a place where I was wanted. That evening, I wrote in my husband's journal again. Today I realized that stepping back is not the same as giving up. Sometimes it is the only way to stand tall. The space between us, my son and I, remained, but it no longer felt like a wound that needed tending. It was simply a fact of the landscape. I could walk around it, build beside it, live fully in the space I had left. And in that space my life began to feel like mine again. The first real sign that my quiet shift had taken root came on a Wednesday morning, when Daniel called. His voice was calm, but there was a note of certainty in it, as though he had been thinking over something for days. He told me he had decided to take a small extra step, nothing dramatic, nothing that would stir unnecessary trouble, but something that would close the circle on what we'd begun. "I've filed the documents," he said, with a formal statement attached. "It's now part of the wedding's financial record." He explained that this wasn't a lawsuit, not even a dispute. It was an acknowledgement, signed and stamped, that my contribution had been made and fulfilled before any other payments. The kind of document that sits quietly in a file, but cannot be erased without leaving a mark. "If anyone ever goes looking," he added, "the truth will be there in black and white." I thanked him, my voice steady. There was a warmth in my chest, not the kind that comes from victory, but the kind that comes from being seen. Someone besides me knew the truth and had chosen to preserve it without fanfare or force. After we hung up, I made a pot of tea and let the steam warm my face. My thoughts wandered to the times in my life when I had felt most alone: my mother's absence after she passed, the long nights after my husband's funeral, the quiet apartment after my son moved away. In all those moments I had told myself that I had no one to lean on. Yet here I was leaning just a little on someone who had remembered a kindness from decades ago and chosen to return it. It made me think of the ways we leave marks on people without realizing it. A plate of food delivered to a sick neighbor. A ride given on a rainy day. A conversation that lingers long after the words fade. Daniel had been a boy when I knew his mother, shy and polite, always listening more than speaking. I had never thought much about how those afternoons in their kitchen might have mattered to him. But now, years later, here he was standing beside me in a way my own family would not. That afternoon I took out my knitting for the first time in years. The yarn slid between my fingers in a steady rhythm, the quiet click of the needles filling the room. It wasn't about the scarf I was making. It was about creating something solid, one stitch at a time, much like the slow reclaiming of my own sense of worth. The next day I walked to the park. The air was cool, the branches bare, but the benches along the path were empty and waiting. I sat for a long time watching a young couple push a stroller past. The woman glanced my way and smiled. A small, genuine gesture that felt oddly grounding. I thought about how easy it is to believe that worth comes from the people who claim you. For so long, I had believed my place in my son's life was the anchor of who I was. But now I was beginning to see something else. Worth can live quietly outside of those circles in the simple fact of existing as yourself. That evening, I wrote Daniel a short note on a cream-colored card I'd been saving for something important. I thanked him not just for his help, but for his care, for making sure the truth didn't vanish into silence. I told him I hoped the world was kind to him, as he had been to me. I sealed it and walked it to the postbox before I could overthink it. The following Sunday, I attended the library's knitting circle. There were 7 of us, most older women, one younger man who was learning how to make a baby blanket for his sister. We talked about small things, the weather, books we'd read, the price of yarn, and not once did anyone ask about my family or my past. It felt like a kind of freedom to be known only for who I was in that moment, not for who I was to someone else. On my walk home, I passed the church where I'd once imagined my son's wedding might take place. I didn't slow down. I didn't look in the windows or picture the scene. Instead, I kept moving, each step a quiet choice to live in the day I was in, not the one I'd been denied. That night, I wrote in my husband's journal again. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's a signature in a file. Sometimes it's a scarf on the needles. Sometimes it's just choosing to keep walking. I closed the book and set it on the table, my hands resting on its cover for a moment before turning off the lamp. The apartment was still, but it no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of being. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. The first ripple came quietly. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and cold, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to my cousin Margaret, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. She sounded cautious at first, asking how I was, commenting on the weather. Then she hesitated, as though weighing whether to say the next part. "I heard something," she said finally. "About the wedding." I waited. She told me she'd been talking with one of our distant relatives, someone who'd been invited, and they'd mentioned almost in passing that it was interesting how much of the wedding had been funded by the bride's parents. But then apparently another guest had quietly corrected them, saying that wasn't the whole story. My name had been spoken. My role had been acknowledged. Not loudly, not publicly, but it had slipped into the air where others could hear it. I could picture it, the way these things spread. A quiet comment at a kitchen table, a small exchange in the corner of a room. The words passed from one person to another until they reached the very people who'd worked so carefully to erase them. Margaret asked if it was true if I had helped. I told her yes, and I left it at that. There was no need to explain the rest. She didn't press. But I could tell from the soft shift in her voice that she believed me, and that she understood more than I had said. In the days that followed, I heard small echoes from other corners. A neighbor mentioned overhearing someone at the market talking about the mother of the groom, who hadn't been invited. An old church friend stopped me on the sidewalk to say she was sorry for how things had gone. None of these conversations were long, but each one was a reminder. The truth had begun to move. I imagined my son and Claire hearing these murmurs. I wondered if they felt the prick of them, the uncomfortable awareness that not everyone accepted the story they had crafted. I didn't feel satisfaction in the thought, only a kind of solemn justice. The truth had its own quiet way of finding the light, even without my voice pushing it there. One afternoon while I was sorting laundry, I realized something unexpected. I no longer cared whether they tried to explain themselves to others. It didn't matter if they spun the story differently in each room they entered. The facts were out there now, planted like seeds in soil I didn't have to tend. Some would take root, some wouldn't, but my part was done. That evening I walked to the park. The wind had a sharper edge, but I pulled my scarf tighter and kept going. On one bench a young mother sat with her toddler, showing him how to feed the ducks. I thought of all the times I'd done that with my boy, and instead of the ache I'd come to expect, I felt something gentler, a recognition that those days had been mine, and no one could take them from me. When I got home I found an envelope in my mailbox. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. Inside was a short note from Daniel. "Just thought you should know, I received confirmation the file is now complete and archived. It's permanent." 2 words stayed with me. It's permanent. There was comfort in that finality. Whatever else happened, the record would stand. My part in their story could no longer be erased entirely, no matter how much they wished it gone. In the quiet of my apartment, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The street below was nearly empty, save for a man walking his dog. The leaves had long since fallen, leaving the branches bare against the fading sky. I realized I was no longer waiting for an apology, or even acknowledgement from them. That had been the part that weighed on me the most, the unspoken hope that they might someday see me again. But now the need for that had faded. I had been seen, just not by them, and sometimes that is enough. Over the next week, I noticed how the ripples settled into the background. The small mentions from friends and neighbors didn't sting anymore. They felt like the hum of something that had already found its place. The wedding was approaching fast, and I imagined that their focus was on the final details. But somewhere in that planning they would know that I still existed in the narrative. And that knowledge, that quiet, unshakable truth, was mine to keep. That night, I wrote in my husband's journal. Some truths travel slowly, but once they leave your hands they have a way of finding where they belong. I closed the book and felt the kind of calm that doesn't come from winning, but from knowing you no longer have to try. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of pewter and air just cold enough to make my breath visible. I hadn't planned to attend, not at first. But as the day drew near, A thought began to settle in me like a stone at the bottom of a still pond. I didn't need an invitation to stand in my own truth. I wasn't going to disrupt anything. I wasn't going to speak out of turn. I simply wanted to be there, to witness the day I had, in my own way, helped to make possible. I took my time getting ready. Not in a rush, not with the excitement of celebration, but with a steady, deliberate calm. I chose the soft blue dress my husband had always liked, the one that made me feel dignified without drawing attention. I pinned my hair neatly and fastened the silver brooch my mother had given me when I was young. It wasn't jewelry for display, it was armor. Before leaving, I slipped my husband's journal into my bag, along with the neat folder of receipts and Daniel's letter. I didn't expect to use them. They were not weapons, they were reminders. Daniel had offered to accompany me, and I accepted. He pulled up outside my apartment in his old Navy sedan, the one with the slightly rattling door. When I stepped inside, he gave me a small nod. No questions, no speeches, just presence. The drive to the venue was quiet. The building came into view slowly, its white-painted exterior standing against the muted winter trees. Outside, guests milled about, adjusting coats and greeting one another. I recognized a few faces, older now, etched with lines of time. Some glanced my way, surprise flickering briefly before settling into polite nods. We walked inside together, the warmth of the room wrapping around us. The ceremony space was beautiful, soft light filtering through tall windows, rows of white chairs, the faint scent of flowers carried on the air. I chose a seat toward the back, where I could see without being in the way. When my son walked in, he didn't see me at first. His eyes were forward, his jaw set in that same determined line I remembered from his school days. Claire followed, radiant in her gown, her arm looped through his. They looked complete in their own way. It wasn't until halfway through the ceremony that his gaze found mine. Just for a moment. His step faltered barely, but I noticed. I didn't smile, didn't frown. I simply met his eyes with the same calm I had carried all morning. He looked away quickly. The vows were exchanged. Rings slipped into place and applause filled the room. I stayed seated for a moment after, letting the crowd rise around me. I wasn't going to the reception. My place was here and only here. I had come to see, not to join. As I stood to leave, Daniel stepped aside to give me space. On my way out, I passed a small table where the guest book lay open. I hesitated, then picked up the pen. I didn't write a message. Just my name. Nothing more, nothing less. It was the quietest way I knew to say I was here. Outside, the air was colder than before, a sharp wind threading through my coat. Daniel and I walked to the car without speaking. Only when we were a few miles away did he glance over and ask, "Do you regret going?" "No," I said. And I didn't. That night, back in my apartment, I took off my coat and sat at the kitchen table. The blue dress hung loose around my shoulders now, the day's weight settling off me. I took out my husband's journal and wrote about the ceremony, about the way my son's eyes had found mine, about the name I'd left in the book. I ended the entry with this. Sometimes the loudest statement is simply standing where they didn't expect you to be, and leaving before they can decide how to react. I closed the book, made a cup of tea, and let the steam curl upward in the quiet. My boundaries were set, my dignity intact. I had shown up not to claim a place but to remind myself that I already had one. In my own life, in my own story. In the days after the wedding, the air in my apartment felt lighter. Not because anything had changed between us, it hadn't, but because I had walked into that room on my own terms and left with my dignity untouched. There was no lingering question of what if. I had stood where I needed to stand, and that was enough. I returned to my routines with a quiet steadiness. Mornings at the kitchen table with tea and toast. Walks to the library when the air was kind. Afternoons spent with the knitting circle, where the talk was light and the laughter easy. There was something healing about being in spaces where I was welcome without condition, where my worth wasn't something I had to defend. The wedding came and went in the eyes of the world. People stopped mentioning it after a week or two. The small ripples it had stirred in my community smoothed over into the everyday rhythm of life. But in me something stayed, a calm sense of place I hadn't felt in a long time. I noticed it most in the little things. When I passed the bakery where I used to buy my son's cinnamon rolls, I didn't feel that sudden pull in my chest. I could look at the display, smell the warm bread, and simply enjoy it for what it was. When I walked by the church where the ceremony had taken place, I didn't slow my steps. I kept moving, my mind free from the urge to look in. One afternoon I went through my desk drawer, the one that had held the envelope of receipts. I placed the documents in a small, sturdy folder and tucked it away with my important papers, my will, my insurance information, my birth certificate. It belonged there now, not in the drawer where I'd once kept it like a wound I couldn't stop touching. I thought of my husband often during those quiet days. I imagined what he would say if he knew all that had happened. I think he would be proud, not because I fought to be included, but because I didn't let myself be erased. He used to tell me that strength wasn't always about pushing forward. Sometimes it was about holding your ground without letting the wind take you. By early spring, the violets on my windowsill began to bloom again. Their small purple flowers opened toward the light, and I found myself smiling each morning when I saw them. They didn't bloom all year, just in their season when the time was right. I felt a kinship with them in that. I also started volunteering once a week at the library. It began with helping sort donated books for the sale, but soon I was organizing shelves, greeting patrons, and even reading aloud during the children's hour. The work was small, but it filled the days with purpose. I didn't think about who noticed or who didn't. It was enough that I was there, doing something that mattered to me. Every now and then, I'd hear a piece of news about my son and Claire. A neighbor mentioned they'd gone on a honeymoon. Someone else said they were looking at houses. I listened politely, offered a nod, and went on with my day. The news no longer cut into me. It was simply part of the world beyond my walls, a world I didn't need to step into unless I chose to. The truth was, I had learned something I wished I'd known long ago. Peace doesn't come from being invited into someone else's story. It comes from living fully in your own. One Sunday evening, I sat in my armchair with the journal open in my lap. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car outside. I began to write, not about the wedding or the months leading up to it, but about the life I was building now, the mornings at the library, the knitting circle, the violets on the sill. I wrote about how the ache had softened into something I could carry without feeling its weight all the time. About how I no longer waited for the phone to ring. About how I had stopped measuring my days by someone else's recognition. When I put the pen down, I realized something. I was no longer looking backward. The path behind me was there, but it didn't pull at my feet. My steps were pointed forward, toward days I could fill as I pleased. I closed the journal and looked around my little apartment. The soft lamplight, the tidy shelves, the scent of the violets drifting through the room. It wasn't much to anyone else, but it was mine. Entirely mine. And for the first time in a long while, that was more than enough. Some evenings now, when the sun dips low and the light turns golden against the walls, I sit with a cup of tea and think about the roads we take without realizing where they'll lead. I think about the girl I once was, standing on my mother's porch, watching her be left out of her own family's story. I think about the woman I became, raising my son with every ounce of strength I had, believing love would always be enough. And I think about the day I learned it wasn't, at least not the kind I was hoping for. But more than that, I think about what came after. The stillness. The choice to stop chasing what didn't want to be caught. The decision to plant my own feet, to live on my own terms, and to protect the truth of who I am quietly but firmly. There is no bitterness in me now. Only a deep understanding that not every story will include you, even the ones you helped build. But that doesn't mean you disappear. Your worth does not dissolve because someone else looks away. I've come to believe that dignity lives in the moments when you choose not to shrink. When you stand even in silence with the knowledge of what you've given and who you've been. And so my life goes on, in the library aisles, at the knitting table, in the soft care of violets turning toward the light. My days are smaller now, but they are mine. Entirely mine. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, I want you to hear this. Your place in this world is not given by invitation. It is claimed by living fully, even when no one is watching. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, you're not alone. Your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments.